Chapter 24, Chinatown, Spring 2001. On April Fool's Day, Mondo caught the Greyhound home from the California Youth Authority. Paroled for the second time, he looked forward to seeing Erica and the 6-month-old baby he'd hardly known. His son was born while he was locked up. He planned to have a visit with this girl and quickly head out to plug into the regiment. But then he held his boy, rocked him in his arms, and stared into his tiny eyes that were the color of water just like his own. He knew he shouldn't linger. He had to hustle over to Sophie Roach's house. He stressed out about this meeting the entire way home from YA. He was torn by the choice he was offered. He hadn't made the commitment of being a carnal in the NF. At his level, you were allowed to step back from the gang when you were out of prison. But if you were ambitious, you could put in work under the leadership of the new NF crew boss in town. It was a tough choice. On the one hand, he loved gang life. So many parties, so many females. The last time he paroled, he noticed a bunch of his homeboys had gotten married and settled down with their regular jobs. But he didn't join them. After Alyssa, Mondo had given up on all that. If he wanted to stay in the gang life, his only choice now was to go 100% professional. On top of that, a lot of people were expecting things from him because of his family's reputation, because of who he already was. He left YA eager to put in work. But now, he held his son and he wanted to stay in this room forever. Ached to watch him grow and score his first touchdown. He wanted to cheer for his boy after school the way his own daddy rarely had. When he'd first laid eyes on the newborn in the youth authority's visiting room, he thought the baby didn't look like him, and he questioned Erica's fidelity. Then he read his own thoughts in the boy's expressions and his heart lifted. The tiny baby was round and chubby, but he had those eyes and the intense stare of his daddy. They drove through the streets of Salinas, winding towards Sophia Roach's house. It was so good to be home, but he felt anxiety rise. Mondo almost didn't want to leave when Erica pulled over. He kissed his son and stepped outside. If he could remember how to weep, he would have fought back the tears as he walked to the door. But it had been years since he let emotions overcome him, and he pulled himself together. He knew he had to report in, but he would let his channel know he'd made his choice. His choice was to be a father. Stepping back was very easy, but his old friends had done it. The homies who'd fallen into jobs and marriage while Mondo was in YA would sympathize. As fellow family men, they'd respect the things that had changed. He had a son now. It would be tough raising a kid on a working man's wage, especially after making a couple hundred in an hour or two robbing Border Brothers. That was going to be one hell of an adjustment. He did not kid himself about that. No more buying Erica something nice every time she got mad. And the females, the welcome home from the pinta parties. He would miss those times too, with Erica and a baby now hanging on his arm. But every sacrifice was worth it to be with his son. His dad had never been there like he was going to be for his boy. Big Mondo was always in jail or partying with the homies, even missing Mondo's first fight in Bakersfield. The kid loved to box. The kid he boxed that day so long ago was now an Olympic champion. Growing up, Mondo had missed so much without realizing it, and he would not make the same mistakes with his son. There was still plenty of time for him, for them. Hell, he could go to college, get back into sports, and maybe become the first Norteño in the major leagues. As he approached Sophie's apartment, Mondo smiled and blinked, knowing how his heart would burst at seeing his boy in a football jersey or bragging to him about his first little girlfriend. It was just crazy how fatherhood did all this to him. He knocked and he woke from his dream. Sophie's latest boyfriend opened the door while talking on the phone. Mondo asked for Sophie, and the guy asked Mondo who he was. Mondo asked where was Bubba. The guy handed him the phone, and Mondo told Sophie he had just got out and was looking for his homies. Sophie told him Bubba was in jail, but he would be out in a few days. Mondo was to report to a new crew. Mondo handed the phone back to the lanky, nervous-looking guy in the doorway. He would later learn the man was called Stalker. Mondo walked away, the door shutting behind him and his hope for a new life vanishing as breezily as it had arisen. It never occurred to Mondo to be afraid as he walked the tracks behind La Rancherita tortilla factory. Yeah, my Spanish is terrible. Scanning his path for the next desperate figure and the next sale. Since that day on the phone with Sophie, he had been handed a whole new line of work. Bubba was put in charge of the streets and called Mondo after he got out. But a few days later, it seemed the leaders were tripping on Bubba. So he told Mondo to work under this guy named Boxer. Boxer's a good brother, you'll be cool, Bubba had assured him. A few weeks later, Bubba got popped on a DUI and was placed on freeze. Mondo's new bosses came with new plans. No more shooting at Sureños. The NF was all business, all money. It confused him and bothered him. Wasn't the cause supposed to be about defending your town from the southern invasion? Didn't the kite to unite say that Sureños were their enemies, their true enemies? He missed Bubba and the easy times. No more gangbanging, Boxer said after Mondo almost shot a couple of Sureños. It draws heat. That's not what the NF's about. It's about making money. This is business. The business, as Mondo was learning, was drugs. This switch up in ideology bothered him. It was bittersweet, no, painful, to think that for a brief second he'd actually fantasized about leaving the gang for his son. He didn't understand why he had so abruptly committed to the crew instead of his new family. Perhaps some voice deep inside told him this was his destiny, that he really wasn't capable of anything else and a gangster was all he'd ever be. Anyway, there was no point looking back. He had a job to do, and though it was hard to see how slinging heroin helped the cause more than beating down Sureños, he had to remind himself that the cause was all about sacrifice. The generals had sacrificed, and now they were paying the price by spending their lives behind the walls in the SHU. Those experts surely knew what they were doing during this phase of modernizing the O. The crew now reported to somebody only referred to as the Big Homie. The Big Homie reported straight to the generals in Pelican Bay. His crew leaders supplied the product and took a cut of his action, but Mondo walked the beat alone. His 9mm Glock, his only companion. The tracks were the best place to sell because the cop cars couldn't follow you here like they did all over Soledad Street. Mondo sold directly to the users, and there were 4 or 5 others who worked for him, addicts who resold just enough product to support their own habits. Mondo was rewarded for his efforts. He made $300-400 in a few hours with little trouble from the cops, though the police station was only blocks away. He'd hang till 4 in the morning, waiting in the shadows of the tortilla factory for lost souls to wander out, vampires emerging from the rickety rooms of Chinatown. Between customers, the night was dead. Amtrak's Coast Starlet pulled north well before sunset, though an occasional freight train loaded with produce and sprayed with graffiti sometimes rattled through before dawn. Otherwise, the tracks were silent. After Mondo's customers wandered off to shoot up, they'd slowly return to Chinatown's corners, aging hookers and homeless junkies who loitered under the Republic's Cafe ancient sign, the words "Chop Suey" flickering high above in fake Chinese neon letters. The sad scene was nothing like the Chinatown that sprang to life in the late 1800s, but it did serve as a lingering testament to the neighborhood's role in the history of Salinas gangs. The 4 blocks north of the tracks had once been the destination of Chinese workers who came from farm jobs and who were essentially confined to that segregated section after their citizenship was denied under the Chinese Exclusion Act. California's alien land law said non-citizens could not own land, so for decades Chinatown swelled inside its boundaries, a world folding and refolding into itself. Japanese and Filipino immigrants joined the Chinese, and by day the clubs and restaurants filled with white politicians and growers who enjoyed a good meal even if they did not care to live near the men who prepared it. Naturally teetering on the margins of the law, Chinatown was home to bordellos and gambling halls where Fantan games, Chinese lottery, and Pao Gao poker were played in the earliest days of the American century. Among the fraternal support groups in Chinatown was the Bing Kong Tong Society, which lent a hand to fresh immigrants and built the first floats for the city's rodeo parades. The Tong was a business and teaching center as well as a refuge from a not so welcoming society. A poem painted on a silk panel in one California Bing Kong building offered this bit of hope. There will be a balance, there will be a peace, fairness, and justice throughout the entire nation. But peace and justice were hard to come by, and the Bing Kong Association's rivalry farther north with the Hop Sing and Sui Sing Association's archived infamy. These battles became known as the Tong Wars, which into the 1920s wreaked havoc along the Sacramento River Delta and the San Francisco Bay, and of course fed the hunger of a salacious press. Under an agreement hammered out between Bing Kong and the Sui Song Tong, the associations each ran 4 gambling houses in Salinas, and all were very popular with Chinese and Filipino field workers. A teenager named Hughes Chin worked as a lookout at one where an ingenious alarm system was developed. A fly swatter hung on a nail near the door, but hidden in the wall behind the nail was a buzzer. When he saw police coming, Hughes would push the nail, which pushed the buzzer and notified the men inside. Then he discreetly removed the nail so the frustrated cops couldn't find the alarm. Of course, the neighborhood fascinated the young John Steinbeck, as it would any boy who lived a drainage ditch away from so much vice. I wonder, he once wrote, whether all towns have the blackness, the feeling of violence just below the surface. Of course, it was the only town I knew. Are they all full of dark whispers? There were whispers of murders covered up and only hinted at. At 9 years old, Steinbeck is said to have excitedly biked across the ditch and the tracks to see the blood stains after a Tong ambush, although proof of that trek remains sketchy. But as a kid, he already sensed a violent assertiveness in Salinas, an energy like the compensation for sin. There was a blackness that seemed to rise out of the swamps, a kind of whispered brooding that never came into the open, a subsurface violence that bubbled silently like the decaying vegetation under the black water of the Tool swamps, he wrote. It's unclear whether Steinbeck ever saw the bar floor or the bullet holes in the blood, but the Chinatown massacre did indeed occur. The murder plot unfurled on an April evening in 1912 when 4 men boarded a train to the north in San Mateo. They sat at opposite ends of 2 cars, never speaking to each other. But a conductor and a brakeman noticed that 2 of them carried pistols, one an automatic. When they left the train that evening in Castroville, the 4 apparent strangers walked separately along the platform before they were seen gathering near a shed. 2 days later, 5 men were enjoying a poker game inside a Salinas gambling house at 20 Soledad Street, the heart of Chinatown. 2 of the men from the train, An Git and Yi Yum, burst into the parlor and drew pistols. Yi Yum shouted to his partner, "Start shooting." An Git shot one victim twice while Yi Yum hit another man. Then they both shot the 3rd victim. When the assassins ran to the street, 2 others joined them, their associates, Ho Kim Yu and Chu Bak Yu, who stood around the parlor's front door when the shooting started. As they made their getaway, a 4th man was shot in the street, although no one saw who killed him. Inside the poker room, 2 men survived to tell the police all they witnessed. 5 days after the murders, the 4 assailants were arrested shortly before midnight in Moss Landing, just as they boarded a car brought from Santa Cruz by a fellow Tongman. All 4 suspects were found to be members of the Highbinder Society, Sui Sing. Highbinder was a popular term from the time referring to hitmen and blackmailers in secret societies, almost always Chinese, though the word was sometimes invoked to describe corrupt white politicians too. It is a matter of common knowledge that a highbinder is a man of evil character and murderous tendencies, a judge wrote after the 4 defendants were tried in what appears to be Salinas' first gang conspiracy case. All 4 were quickly found guilty of murder. Defense attorneys claim Ho Kim Yu and Chu Bak Yu, the guys posted up in the doorway who weren't seen shooting anyone, had been railroaded. A San Mateo police officer had testified that he knew them and saw the 2 in his city's Chinatown the night before the murder. But there was also speculation that the Irish-American cop had solicited a $500 payment before making that statement. Ho Kim Yu and Chu Bak Yu filed for appeal. The appeal judges said that all of the defendants belonged to the same highbinder society known as the Sui Sing Tong. and that this highbinder society was at war at the time of the homicide with the highbinder society known as the Hip Sing Tong. To further substantiate the conspiracy, judges noted that the four lived in the same house in San Mateo and had traveled to Castroville and secretly gathered together after they left the platform. Their movements were studied and stealthy, crafted to appear as if they were total strangers on the train. But the appeals court also found instances of serious misconduct by Monterey County prosecutors, noting that the fact that a witness was a Chinaman did not allow the district attorney to suspend the rules of evidence by mentioning that said witness lived with the prostitute. The judges soundly reprimanded the Monterey County DA and his team, saying their conduct not only impairs the orderly and effective administration of justice, but it is well calculated to bring the profession of the law into disrepute. Despite the finding of misconduct, the first-degree murder convictions were upheld and all four men were sentenced to life in prison. By the 1940s, Chinatown had changed. The Exclusion Act was finally repealed in 1943, and Chinese residents fanned into other parts of Salinas like air let out from an overblown balloon. During World War II, the neighborhood's Japanese Americans were rounded up and imprisoned at the Rodeo grounds before being carted off to the internment camp at Manzanar. Chinatown became a ghost town. Mexican American and Filipino dance halls and bars moved in. Leon's Club, El Faro, and later, the Copacabana. The swinging Pachuco clubs were regularly raided by the cops, whose station was only 8 blocks away. But as soon as officers issued citations and turned their backs, the sinning started again. In that aspect, Chinatown hadn't changed in 100 years. At century's end, the brothels, card rooms, and highbinders were all ghosts. And although the Tongs still owned much of Soledad Street's real estate, Chinatown's vice belonged exclusively to the Nuestra Familia. In the hours after daylight, it was Mondo's turf. The junkies knew to look for his tall, swaggering silhouette, and the hookers took a moment to flirt with the handsome boy before coughing up cash for a brief salvation of his black tar chiva.